Okay, good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking in English in this panel because two of our distinguished guests are not Brazilian. So we've been talking a lot about different topics here: political reform, corruption, social policy, education, health. And the idea of this panel is to approach Brazil from a global perspective. Brazil, in many ways, is not isolated. The emerging world is going through enormous transformation. The global economy is going through enormous transformation. And we asked these three distinguished experts on the global economy to think with us new opportunities, possibilities, and challenges that Brazil will be facing, is facing now, and will be facing in the next few years. So let me start presenting Professor Roberto Rigobon. Professor Rigobon is the Society of Sloan Fellows Professor of Management and a Professor of Applied Economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He has done a lot of work on international economics, monetary economics, development, paying particularly attention to balance of payment crisis, financial crisis, financial contagion, and he's from Venezuela, so I think we can have some good lessons about a collapsing economy, with all due respect, of course. To my left, without any ideological connotation, of course, Professor Robert Lawrence, who's the Albert Williams Professor of International Trade and Investment at the Kennedy School. He's also a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. He served in the Bill Clinton administration as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. He's originally from South Africa, but American. And to my right, Otaviano Canuto, whom we heard from yesterday. Otaviano is executive director at the board of the IMF for Brazil and 10 other countries. He held senior positions with the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank. At the World Bank, he was senior advisor on BRICS economies. And he also served as state secretary for international affairs at Brazil's Ministry of Finance. He's originally from Aracaju, Sergipe. So we're going to have short presentations, 10-minute presentations from the three experts, and then we're going to open the floor to questions. I'm going to start with Professor Rigobon. Thank you, Professor.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad that you are clapping before I speak. So first, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for allowing me to share this podium with old friends. Rob Lawrence and I have known each other for a long, long time, and Otaviano's wife actually worked at La CEA when I was the president in La CEA, so I have known them for a long, long time. So it's great that our paths cross again. The question is, I didn't know exactly how to answer the question, but how to make Brazil relevant in the global economy. I had a short answer, which is do exactly the opposite of what Venezuela has done. And therefore, I'm done. Thank you so much. The longer answer to that question is that in order to be relevant worldwide, I think that there require two ingredients. One is performance, and the other one is leadership. And I think that the performance of Brazil's economy has been lacking for decades, and the leadership seems to be completely unwanted. Brazil very rarely takes strong positions about important aspects of the region or the world, and it's just happy not to get involved. And it's and I think that to be a great nation, you have to be way beyond involved. You have to be committed. You have to be committed to the values that are important for your society and that are important for the world. And for that matter, it has to change dramatically moving forward. In terms of performance, I think that performance has many dimensions. One that I think is particularly important for Brazil is that I think it's time for Brazil to stop discussions of ideological things that have been settled. I think it's time, the way I say that in a more insulting way is I think it's time for Brazil to grow up. For example, things that we know are true is that the private sector is not the enemy. So please stop. Stop with that rhetoric and just teach your politicians to speak correctly in that sense. And demand that they actually understand that this is not the way. I mean, Cuba is not what you want to become. Unless, if that's what you want to become, then you should actually apply to another passport. But if you want to become a great nation, these discussions has been settled. For example, it's important for countries to have transparency and accountability. And for that, central bank independence is a not discussion. Politicians are not in the business of telling countries what should they do with the interest rates or with the exchange rate. If you have anything to say about that, just tell to your wife. The rest, the country should not be subject to that involvement. These discussions need to stop. I understand that the solutions to Brazil have to be very Brazilian. And in fact, I always advocate that. The solutions to Venezuela have to be consistent with the social aspirations of the Venezuelan society. The same has to be true for Brazil. Brazil has values that are important for that society. There are aspects about equality, about the environment that are important to you. And in fact, the solutions, the economic solutions, have to be consistent with those values. However, the solutions are not inconsistent or contradictory to basic economic principles. So, in the same way that politics is a constraint for economics, economics should be a constraint for idiotic politics. So, in that aspect, I think it's important that you move on out of these discussions. Second aspect about performance that I find particular, I go like twice a year to Brazil. And it's one of the things that strike me about Brazil is that there are two messages that I always get in every one of those trips. And one is that you want to win the World Cup, which actually is pretty good because as a Venezuelan, I cannot root for Colombia, so I root for Brazil. But the second point is that Brazil is always the country of the future, no? So, and the future that never arrives, by the way. And my view is that, in general, you build a list of prerequisites for greatness. This is kind of the way I look at it. You have a list of things, a laundry list that says, well, Brazil will be a great nation if politicians were great, and if there were no corruption, if the companies were not abusive, if the workers had high skills and they were educated, if there were no problems of crime. I mean, it's a long, long laundry list. If we had institutions and there was institutionality, if we can do, for example, electoral reforms for campaigns, for example. I mean, the laundry list is infinitely long. And then, because that list is almost impossible to achieve, in Brazil, you tend to justify the failures or the lack of performance as just blaming the fact that you couldn't fill the list. I want to remind you that when the United States was declared independence, it was a relatively poor nation, had one thing, which was a constitution, had one idea, that was that the private sector was an important component of progress, that the government should allow the private sector to progress. But that was a horrible democracy. Women didn't vote. The black didn't vote. They had slavery. That was a horrible place. The only thing that the United States had at that time was that Greenspan was already alive. That's it. But except for having the future central banker, the laundry list at that time was horrible. In fact, the United States created Social Security and a lot of the institutions that we think are needed today, they created them after they were the richest nation on earth, not before. So stop thinking about a laundry list. Just build it. This leads me to the last point about leadership. And when I think about leadership, I actually look at you guys. You are the leaders. And I have two questions. Actually, it's the same question, but it's two questions. How do you want to be remembered? And the way I like to put that question usually is not by your legacy, but to think about what is the type of a stereotype you would like people to remember about Brazilians. I know stereotypes are horrible. I know that. But it's kind of very informative about what are the values of that nation. When I think about the stereotypes of my country, the Venezuelans, we're a nation of corrupt, inept citizens that know how to dance. That's a very pathetic stereotype. But in fact, whenever I go to any place and I tell anyone that I'm from Venezuela, they say, oh, you must be fun. Yeah. Which is true. I know how to dance. In fact, in Venezuela, they don't give you a passport unless you are a good dancer. I understand that. But that is a very bad way to be remembered. When I tell you that I met someone from Korea, you will immediately create an image of that person. And then I said, no, I was talking about North Korea. I can assure you your stereotype will just shift tremendously. If I said I have a student from Germany, he has a stereotype. So how do you want to be remembered? How? And I think it's very important as a nation that you think about what is the way the Brazilians need to be remembered. And then you take responsibility for that. I think it's time to stop constructing a list and blaming the failures on that list. Start being a little bit more pragmatic and, start working hard. I have no doubts, absolutely no doubts that the Brazilians can do it. You just have to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rigobon. And I pass to Professor Lawrence.
So I'm going to move to be somewhat more specific about and talk about the trading system. And the previous speaker in the last session discussed Winston Churchill, and he described how at one point in time Winston Churchill looked like a crazy man who was aggressive and in a sense, and then he was busy getting drunk, but nonetheless his time came. And when his time came, he turned out to be an incredible leader. But only for the war, because after the war, as the previous speaker pointed out, they threw him out of office. Well, I believe we've lived through a period, actually, which has been very compatible with Brazilian leadership at one level, if we look at the trading system. And that's because it's been a period, of course, with booming commodity prices. And the consequence of that has enabled Brazil to lead in certain of the global institutions. And I will talk very briefly about its role specifically in the trading system. The Doha Round, the multilateral trading system, negotiations that were launched in 2001, were actually an ideal opportunity for Brazilian leadership, because the Doha Round sought to promote the interests of developing countries and emphasized agriculture. And so you could see how the G20 group of countries formed in order to promote their agricultural interests, in order to get subsidies cut in the developed world, especially to the farmers in the developed world. And it was a period in which the multilateral system, in a sense, became the focal point of attention. But the world has changed. And in fact, the Doha Round has collapsed and ended in failure. There is not going to be a successful Doha Round in the way it was originally envisaged. And what we've seen, rather, is a fragmentation of the global trading system, and one manifestation has been that collapse in the Doha Round. You see, Brazil and other emerging economies have become too significant in the global economy to ignore, but nonetheless, the stances which they have been taking are at odds with what many other countries are seeking. So let me be more specific. The world has developed global supply chains. Products today are no longer made in a specific country, but they're made in the world. And in order to effectively implement a system where products are being made in many different parts of the world, you need a certain kind of governance. You need rules of the game. And some countries are eagerly seeking to construct agreements which actually implement deeper integration in order to provide rules of the game that allow for this very extreme form of international specialization. And that's what we're seeing with the emergence of large regional groupings, the so-called mega-regional arrangements. The United States has concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership with 12 countries in the Asia-Pacific. The western part of Latin America has formed the Pacific Alliance, where those countries are seeking to develop deeper regional agreements. The RCEP is even another Asian agreement which seeks deeper integration. We've seen a profusion of regional arrangements where willing countries have grouped themselves together in order to seek this deeper regional integration. But in the environment in which it was operating, Brazil has not joined those institutions. In a sense, it has not joined in a leadership way. To be sure, it has been part of the BRICS agreements, but if you look at their trade agreements, they're pretty superficial in nature because these are very diverse countries. Now the world has changed. Commodities are no longer going to be the driver of economic growth for Brazil. And in a sense, the great challenge for Brazil is now, how does it develop competitive manufacturing? How can it be a competitive industrial economy? Now, part of that is obviously all kinds of domestic reforms that need to be put in place. And there's a long list, and anyone can tell you about the problems of high taxes and poor infrastructure and high real interest rates and unskilled workers. But there also needs to be a lot of new thinking, in my view, about the global environment in which Brazil is going to operate. There are real challenges now. For instance, is it sufficient for Brazil to be part in its regional relationships with the Mercosur? Is that adequate in order to promote the kind of governance that a supply chain which could supply both the regional markets and the global markets could provide? I don't think so. So I think there needs to be a re-examination of that dimension, and the open question is, how does Brazil join with these other developments when it comes to regional arrangements? There are also questions about the future of the WTO. Brazil has been a leader in the WTO, and the multilateral trading system is basically the only place we're going to take care of problems relating to agriculture, for instance. So I think Brazil has to lead in the WTO, but it has to take account of the fact that it is no longer true that we are going to get a single agreement that can satisfy all the countries who are members of the WTO. The WTO itself needs to allow for more differentiation. And that's actually the big debate currently. There are some who say, no, we need a single undertaking. We need stark differences between developing countries and developed countries. The developed countries need to have certain responsibilities, and then the developing countries should have special and differential treatment. Well, you know, that was exactly the view when it came to climate change. And the world got nowhere on the climate regime until it was recognized that that artificial division didn't work in climate, because the large emitters of CO2 are the large emerging economies. And no matter what the developed countries do, you're not going to deal with climate change unless you have a new regime. Well, in exactly the same way, the global trading system has changed, and the large emerging economies, the BRICS and others, cannot be ignored. They have to be incorporated. One rule will not suffice. And so what we need to move towards, and I believe Brazil should be a leader in this, is a system that is much more pluralistic, that doesn't simply have an artificial division between advanced and developing, but rather adopts the same approach that we've seen in climate change, where differentiation is recognized. Of course, not all countries can make the same obligations, but at the same time, what we need is to allow for this multilateral institution to accept the fact that certain countries can sign agreements that go deeper than other countries. If you will, what the Europeans call a variable geometry. So in my view, the multilateral system that will best suit Brazil will be one in which groups of countries, both developed and developing, can sign agreements on new issues, whether they are investment, or whether they relate to standards, or whether they relate to regulation. And other groups don't have to join, so that we need to construct a system which accommodates diversity, but is nonetheless inclusive. So that's the challenge out there. An international environment and a regional environment that match the new changes and challenges that confront Brazil today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence. Now, please, Otaviano.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. These two great presentations that we had before me, they give me a substantial base on which to try to build and add my comments. I will start with the Professor Lawrence points, to which I tend to agree to them all. Fact is, by coincidence, in a previous incarnation, I was the guy in the Ministry of Finance in Brazil, interacting with diplomacy, who were leading the the Brazilian part in the trade negotiations. And most of what Professor Lawrence said was much well recognized within some parts of the government, but we lost the battle. Brazil is among its peers, the most closed economy of the world. Even if one takes into account the size, even if anyone takes into account the location in Latin America, which is outside the scope of most of the regional value chains, Brazil still exhibits ratios of exports plus imports to GDP that are lower than any comparable country. Trade facilitation in Brazil is exactly contrary-wise. This is one of the chapters of the Doing Business report of the World Bank, where Brazil ranks among the worst performers in the world. It's not easy to do trade business in Brazil. Unfortunately, this view, this perception of which has lost its whatever usefulness it had, has become completely obsolete, and Professor Lawrence is right. It has resisted any change in Brazil. The good news is that even the Brazilian proneness towards closeness is starting to change because, among other reasons, the economic agents are realizing that it doesn't work. No matter you have Mercosur, nonetheless, the Chinese imports of manufacturing goods are simply exploding. In the Brazilian, for instance, the Brazilian industrial sector has already started to adapt itself to the circumstance. And they all have used the remaining protectionist measures that still prevail simply to maximize rents from the existing capacity. But they're not investing in something that they know they are not feasible. And by the way, Professor Lawrence, the only point of your presentation regarding which I wouldn't feel very much comfortable with is that you framed the Brazilian future on competitive manufacturing. I would say that the distinction between manufacturing, service, agriculture is no longer as effective as it used to be in the past. The Brazilian competitiveness in agriculture, it is roughly the value, if one can decompose the value added in a soya, in a ton of soya produced by Brazil, the part that you would attribute to agriculture itself, to the work of Mother Earth in the land, is less than 10% of it. And in fact, the Brazilian competitive soya is, what it has there embedded is technology, not only on the seeds, but also weather forecasting, whenever they can appropriate ways to store soya and so on. At the same time, when one thinks of manufacturing, manufacturing is no longer, what manufacturing are we talking about? The design of the iPad, which is more of service than manufacturing, or the simple task of putting things together that is, by the way, losing relevance anyway. So we should, instead of looking, and this is quite important because of a false debate that takes place in Brazil yet about manufacturing versus commodities, as if any of these were significant entities. So I guess we should frame your point better in terms of competitive in Brazil. We'll have to become competitive in technology-intensive, medium-range technology-intensive, at least, activities, science-based activities, and so on. And global value chains that can be led by activities in Brazil, regardless, probably very much backed by natural resource richness. I think this is a better way to frame, because as far as the low labor cost manufacturing, forget about it. After China, not only we are watching technology trends pointing out to a reversal of offshoring, to be seen how far this will go, but also at the World Bank, I've seen this for 12 years. The Chinese production is partially delocating itself to Cambodia, to Vietnam, to Ethiopia in Africa. And if India does what it takes in the labor market regulation, India might be the next exactly crossing the trajectory followed by China over the last 30 years. And Professor Lawrence is perfectly right when he points out the different nature of the new trade negotiations at play. The TTIP and TTP and TPP, they differ enormously from Doha in the sense that, the gains from trade liberalization, the straightforward, direct effects, are nowadays, they will not be as great as probably the secondary effects of harmonization of rules and the kind of improvement in business environment that will follow from the rules negotiation embedded in the TPP and TTIP. I know a couple of research showing exactly that, how different, one looks at the direct effects, they're not that big. But when one takes into account the potential using simulation with general equilibrium models and so on, the secondary effects, then things change dramatically. The good news, Professor Lawrence, is the following. We know that Uruguay round was into stalemate when the Americans decided to, okay, let's do something else. And then they came for the NAFTA. And that ended up creating an impulse in the multilateral scheme that helped Uruguay round to be closed. I don't expect that Doha round will be, let's say, put back, in a path of conclusion necessarily as it is, but certainly TTIP and TPP will spark a higher interest from whoever is not in there. It has been the case of Brazil. Now, for the first time, one sees more enthusiasm about moving forward with the negotiation between Mercosur and Europe and so on. The fact is that it's a sea change that will have dramatic implications. And finally, using my last minute to Professor Rigobon, which he pointed out the need to move ahead with the institutional reform agenda, I would remind you, some of you were yesterday when Professor Ban made a fantastic presentation on the middle-income trap. I have participated in several research on the same topic, but we look at what allowed the successful middle-income countries to jump to high-income levels. And they all have one thing in common, namely, after crossing a similar process that can be aptly described by the model by Sir Arthur Lewis. I hope this has been out of fashion of development economics, but I would suggest tremendously you guys to give a look at the analysis of Sir Arthur Lewis that gave him the Nobel Prize. They all see, Brazil, Mexico, any Latin American country, the tigers, China, and even Japan before them, they all had one thing in common. They went through a process of delocation of people from subsistence activities, usually in rural areas, to, without necessary change in their educational level, these people could be transferred to the cities and deal and work in modern tradable activities. And simply by that move, the total factor productivity rose dramatically, as in the case of China, but that was the case of Brazil. Not all these countries avail themselves equally of the opportunity. We, for instance, Brazilians, did not take the chance to raise up the level of education of the labor force, as the Korean did and as the China are doing. But the point is that the successful case, all of them, with no exception, including Israel, Mauritius, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, China, otherwise I will be in trouble, right? They all have one thing in common. At a certain moment, they shift the nature of their policies towards enhancing the institutions that underpin an advanced market economy. And that's really the dilemma faced by the Chinese now. Once I gave an interview to Radio China International on middle-income trap, and 2 weeks later, the guy called me to say that, not because of me, but that interview had broken their records in terms of hits. And why is that? Because when you talk to middle-income trap and the challenge faced by middle-income countries to go up, any well-informed Chinese, pays attention. And they don't want to repeat the mistakes that we made, which was exactly to stop in the past, thinking that repeating the old policies would lead us to the next stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Otaviano. I'm going to, before we open the floor to questions, I'm going to ask all the presenters to give a very brief comment on what was discussed here, like 2 minutes, to enhance the debate here amongst you. And I wonder if I can make a provocation here, say that we do have an impeachment in Brazil, and 1 month from now, you receive a call from President Temer, or I don't know, President Temer, asking what specific policy would you suggest in terms of the global economy, or what specific strategy? You can only say one. So what would be your answer, please? And I'll start with Professor Rigobon. Yeah.
One policy. I actually will, if I have to pick only one, crap, that's a tough one. I will pick one that is short-term, and I start with that. I will remove a lot of regulation so the private sector can flourish, and that will be my first one. It's a massive deregulation.
I cannot resist, but a there was a press interview with someone from the Russian economy, and the press, like our chairman, was very impatient about getting long-winded answers. And so the press said to him, listen, in one word, describe the Russian economy. That's a good one. And he came back and he said, good. And then the interviewer thought, well, maybe I should explore this a little bit more. He said, how about 2 words? He said, no good. So I don't think there's a silver bullet, but I do believe in the importance of the real exchange rate in setting the environment for everything else. That you can have a lot of government subsidies to individual industries, or you can just think about the fact that a weaker real exchange rate is the equivalent of a subsidy for all of your exports and a tariff or tax on all of your imports. So wouldn't it be better to do a single measure, which is the one I'm advocating? Now, how do you achieve a real exchange rate change? It's not as easy as simply telling your central bank to weaken the nominal rate, the monetary rate. No, what you really require is considerable fiscal discipline. You have to have a government budget that is much tighter, and that in turn gives the monetary authorities the ability to, in a sense, provide lower interest rates. So I think you need enhanced government saving as part of a strategy to achieve a weaker real exchange rate that in turn can create a competitive environment for all of your firms. And rather than have the government try to select and to incentivize individual industries or preferred sectors, which is the source of a lot of your corruption problems, create an environment in which the firms themselves are more competitive.
Thank you, Professor Lawrence.
Yes. The IMF, through the World Economic Outlook, has made such a proposal, which is to combine a tripod of policy suggestions. First of all, go easily in unwinding the unconventional monetary policies, because we don't know exactly how resilient is the global economy. But second, it's quite important, we should replace it or support it by using more actively fiscal policy wherever there is a space. We don't have to be as conservative, fiscally speaking, as the Germans have been and so on. So there would be space in some areas, particularly of advanced economies, that could step in with proactive fiscal policies, allowing the others in themselves to use less aggressive monetary policy. And finally, the third item, please look out what are the structural reforms that would boost productivity and growth in each one of the countries. This is a country-specific task. The range and necessity of structural reforms varies dramatically, but we do need to push ahead more than ever this agenda, because clearly the growth potential of the global economy has shifted down vis-a-vis what the speed at which it was in previous years. So it's time to prioritize doing the homework in terms of structural reforms.
Thank you very much. We're going to open the floor to questions. Again, please present yourself, be brief, and end your question with a question mark.
Hi, my name is Isabel Ross. I'm a first-year MIT MBA student. Before business school, I was working with the International Finance Corporation structuring public and private partnerships projects. Mr. Canuto mentioned yesterday he talked about the PPPs and as one of the possible solutions for the development of the private sector in Brazil. Professor Rigobon today also highlighted the importance of the development of the private sector in Brazil. My question for you is, what role do you see that BNDES, the Brazilian National Development Bank, should have in the development of the private sector. Basically, my question is, are they extremely important in allowing all those projects and infrastructure projects to happen, since they're the major lenders of the country? Or are they preventing the development of the financial sector as they provide extremely high subsidized rates? So that's my question.
You're addressing the question for the three of them, or anyone specific? Or?
Whoever feels more comfortable in answering it. I'm very interested in learning about their opinion. Thank you.
So I don't know exactly if they are impeding or not. Let me tell you from the principal point of view. I think that a Bank of Development should be on the financing, not on the deciding of the projects. I think that the private-public partnership should be thinking about what is important for Brazil. That has to come from individuals like you, and then they should be providing the financing. I don't mind that the financing is subsidized, because a lot of these projects have a much bigger social return than private return. So that's so the issue of the subsidy, I am less concerned with the issue of the subsidy. I'm concerned with the fact that usually these development banks in Latin America not only provide the financing, but they are the ultimate deciders. And I don't think that someone in an office in Brasilia might know better what to do. And I think that that's a mistake that we make. So I think there's a role for this type of financing, and I think it should be mostly financing. That's where I will put a full stop.
I agree with Roberto, and let me try to.
We agree?
Yes.
Okay, so this is true then.
Yes, with a couple of caveats that I will try to make.
Okay. That makes more sense.
The point is, there is a wide scope for value being added by this type of development banks like the BNDES. It is not by chance that if you take all G20 countries, except for the US, you will find development banks. And why is that? There has been a mirage in global finance. If one looks at the capital flows to emerging markets, they, for several years, looked like they would be sustained even after, in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis. So people looked at those data and said, look, what are you talking about? There is long-term bond financing rising. After the blip, 2009, 2010, they, wow, come and rise up. Watch out. When you break down the composition of those flows, you will find there bond finance, which is not necessarily the best available source of finance for investments at the very early stage, the greenfield investments. They are good for brownfield investments when everything is, the uncertainties are cleared. And that's where, in the financing of some greenfield investment projects, where you cannot find clearly there is so much uncertainty in the market cannot, that these development banks may play a role. But this is a typical case where much more is less, more becomes less. And that has been the case of Brazil. Brazil went much beyond the crowding in phase and start crowding out any possibility of a participation of private finance. So ultimately, the response to your question about the role of these institutions depends on the establishment of ways to evaluate what Rigobon said regarding when is that these institutions add value or not. And certainly, size matters. And these institutions should also do the thing. Once a project succeeds, they divest them. They pass away in order to keep the space for a new project, particularly because it's a highly subsidized one. And PPP has to be understood in the way. You have to go to each one of the value chains of infrastructure service, and we'll find there areas and zones where the public sector does a better job than the private sector, such as ironing out basic design aspects of a project with respect to environment and so on, whereas there are other areas in these of these chains where the private sector is a better manager and can finance it quite clearly.
Well, I guess I'm somewhat more skeptical than my two colleagues, particularly as this is implemented in Brazil. And I do think that while we have very clever rationalizations for the policies, I think a lower real interest rate should be the number one goal of Brazilian policy. And I would differ, actually, with the notion of a proactive fiscal policy. Well, proactive, yes, in the sense of aiming for a much lower deficit in order to induce higher interest rates. Brazil is so conspicuous by the level of its interest rates, in my view. I'm going to finish, and then you can go on.
Speak about Brazil. I was talking about the global economy. Germany.
Well, I'm talking about Brazil.
Okay.
And in a sense, I think Brazil is emblematic of the dangers of having the public provision of extensive amounts of finance. I think finance is actually not the most important thing that industrial policy ought to be doing. It should be coordinating, occasionally giving some money, but by and large, in a sense, orchestrating coordinated action where the private sector needs it. But I would come back to the importance of providing lower interest rates to investors throughout the economy, as opposed to selectively choosing certain firms and then leaving the rest with very high costs of capital.
Let me agree with Rob in this point and summarize it differently. I think that the best development policy that Brazil can do right now is macroeconomic stabilization. So just lowering those interest rates, I think, will be. But let me change from deregulation to macroeconomic stabilization as the single policy.
Sorry, but I have to clarify this because wrong words have been put in my mouth.
Okay,
it's obvious that the prominent need in terms of policy in Brazil is fiscal. What I did say is the following. There are cases among advanced economies that the output gap of which, as well as the existence of enormous fiscal buffers, might allow them to do a bit more in, for instance, financing investments in infrastructure that would help their partners to get away from difficulties. That's the case of Europe.
Okay.
The adjustment of Southern Europe would have been much more facilitated if Germany was not so excessively austere. That's the point.
No, I'm in violent agreement with you. when it comes to Germany, it's okay.
Let's take another question. Yes, please.
So my name is Rafael. I'm a first-year MBA student. And my question is about economy. And in Brazil, we have a huge debate between orthodox, that are mainstream economists, and heterodox. So I would like to listen, what's your opinion? What are the good side and the bad side about orthodox, and the good side and bad side about heterodox policies?
To me?
I think especially Rigobon and Canuto that knows Latin America in more detail, but...
So, I think that when we divide, so I think that the world is not black and white. And so when I look at Brazil and they ask me a single policy, it assumes that Brazil has one problem. And so when I look at Brazil, I can list 50 problems. And in fact, if you ask me to prioritize the problems, I don't even know. So right now we have a new problem. Neymar is not playing in the Olympics or in the Copa America. I mean, we have another problem. So just the whole point is that by trying to simplify this in a single policy or in a single problem, is that we are forgetting the tremendous complexity. I don't think that the policies in economics are divided by orthodox or heterodox. That's not the division. Now, I do divide them by reasonable and unreasonable. That's certainly the case. So what I think is just, now there are some things that we know. Let me put it this way. So at the beginning of the 20th century, it was the case that we thought that the private sector needed to be regulated because it was evil somehow. And in fact, the financial crisis in 2008 has created that sentiment again. in a lot of countries, where we feel that the banks are evil, and therefore they need to be regulated and crushed. And I think that notion has to change. So that's one. And what do you do to incorporate the private sector and the government to the progress of Brazil? Well, that can be heterodox, that can be very pragmatic, that can be very specific, very Brazilian. Doesn't necessarily have to be some others. But central bank independence and transparency on politics, those things are aspects that we kind of agree today that are important to build these nations. And these are the institutions that need to happen. So my point is, the sequence of how you are going to become the great nation that Brazil deserves to be, I don't know what the sequence is going to be. I don't know exactly what the policies are going to be when you end up that place. But you have to stop thinking about the world being black and white. And so you have to start thinking about what works, what doesn't work. You try something, you evaluate. If it doesn't work, please change. That's simple. To me, it's very simple. Just, you have tried 2 million health education reforms in Brazil. Every time I go, somebody's trying an education reforms. I ask who has done anything. Very few. So my point is, just try something and evaluate. If it doesn't work, just try something else. And in that world, being very pragmatic and very experimentational, you will find what makes Brazil thrive. If you think about China, that's exactly the way China found how to move from a completely controlled economy to the very free economy that they have today. I can assure you nobody thought that allowing the farmers to produce the excess production and then sell in the market was going to be that incredibly impactful, but produced 10 years of 10% growth in the rural area. Well, to be honest, they just tried it. It worked, and they repeat. When they try something that did not work, like, for example, bank opening, and they have a crisis, they just close it. So you are not ready for back, just do it. I think Brazil is in great shape to actually do that. You are a very big country, so you can actually take all Sao Paulo and do all the experiments in Sao Paulo. If it doesn't work, don't move to Rio. That's simple. So it's just very simple. Just try the policies and experiment. There's a great paper written by Danny Roderick, who is a professor in the Kennedy School. He's back in the Kennedy School? Yeah, okay. I didn't know. I just didn't want to say anything inappropriate. So that we have tried to hire at MIT several times, by the way. So Danny wrote a paper many years ago with Andres Velasco about self-discovery. It's a paper about El Salvador. It's not very relevant, but actually, not very relevant for Brazilian problems, but the framework of thinking is an extremely important one, is that Danny doesn't know what El Salvador should do. In fact, no one knows. What you have to do as a government and as a policymaker is create the circumstances so the Brazilians figure out what they are good at. And it might be manufacturing, might not be manufacturing, might be services. So just create the environment for that to happen. And then the private sector will take care of all the jobs and so on. That's it.
Go ahead. Well, I believe that the distinction between orthodox and heterodox is, like Roberto, the wrong way to phrase this. I think economics gives us a lot of different models and rigorous ways to think about things. I think the art of economics is knowing which models apply to which situations. What are the essential features of the situation that are captured in each model? And that requires not simply theoretical wisdom or capacity, but also, in a sense, the ability to recognition ability, to know what the right kind of model is. In certain circumstances, a simple model will do. In other cases, it will lead you to ignore the critical factors. I believe, for instance, the reason we got into the financial crisis was that we were using very simple models which overlooked key ingredients of the way people behave, and the result was we, and in particular, say, our regulators, just believed that the private sector had every incentive to take care of all of the risks. They had the wrong model in their heads, and the result was disastrous regulatory policy. So I think it's a matter of diagnosis, in a sense, not just simply the models, but the ability to recognize which ones are the most appropriate. I was with Danny and Andres when they were on that trip to El Salvador, and another idea that emerged was the notion of binding constraints. Countries have many problems. Actually, it comes back to the way our chairman focused the question. Countries face many problems, but at certain junctures, you need to be able to say what are the 2 or 3 most important things for them to focus on at that time. And that's when using the right model can actually become critical.
Look, the more you approach yourself to policy, the more you understand how silly it is, this generic distinction between orthodox and heterodox. Only purely academic people stay stuck on it. The more you go to policy issues, you approach something like Professor Lawrence was describing. And by the way, when I was vice president of the IDB, we hired Professor Hausman, who was a co-author of Danny and Velasco on the, and they did a series of reports, country reports, trying to canvass as a suggestion on what would be the binding constraint in all this case. So when we talk to people like those who are closer to the policy level, it's a former academic here, please, and this is quite important in the case of Brazil, where the political positions mix up with, are you orthodox or heterodox? Go beyond it, because in practice, the most intelligent policymakers that I have ever personally met, they are not bound by these labels.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, my name is Rosabelle Coelho-Quezar. I manage the MIT Brazil program here at MIT. And my question basically is post-growth economics, and basically coming to Mr. Canuto's, the latest point that you made while you were talking. And a question is how emerging markets should be thinking about, a sustainable development instead, because it's impossible to sustain the kinds of growth that sometimes the economist is always expecting countries to be showing. So thank you.
Do you want to start?
No, I think you touched a key area. Like Professor Lawrence mentioned, the insufficient of the orthodox take on some orthodox economies, because some others, the BIS, the Bank for International Settlement, was forewarning about the hidden risks underlying the massive bubbles since the beginning of the new millennium. But most economists who couldn't see, they were wrong. And the same applies to the sustainability dimension of growth, which most economists in the past did the following. Okay, it's time for us to be environment. Okay, and then we become green, and then we forget it and go back to business as usual, without taking into account the dimension of sustainability, not only of natural resources themselves, but in their use. I would recommend in this case an effort that the World Bank made in trying to create an accounting system for natural wealth, giving value and separating the capital formation in the built capital, which is, for instance, infrastructure or machines and equipment, differentiated from the human capital or the stock of accumulated total factor productivity, and the natural wealth assets that can be consumed or transformed into another assets. Because then you see through that accounting how well the countries are performing when it comes to the sustainable use of natural resource assets. It is not to leave nature untouched. But at least in the case of renewable resource, is to make sure that they are used not to feed present consumption, but rather the future supported by new types of assets. But I'm saying this, but as I have here, we have here the best Brazilian environmental economist who worked in this project, Mr. Professor Sérgio Margulis over there, right? Did I say it right?
I have a funny anecdote about that BIS document. I actually worked as a discussant of that document in 2004 And one of my greatest regrets is that I did not even believe my own research enough to short the stock market. You have no idea how much I regret that.
Good morning. My name is Camila. I'm doing the LLM here at Harvard Law School. So my question is mainly for Professor Lawrence, but if anyone wants to chime in, please feel free. So you mentioned that Brazil should take the lead in the development of trade law, international trade law, and I believe that Brazil may be doing that by creating this new model for investment treaties, which is the cooperation and facilitation investment treaties, which are quite different from the traditional BITs, bilateral investment treaties. So my question is, do you think that this is the most appropriate way of going forward as regarding investment development in Brazil, or should Brazil focus its energy more on the regional treaties or maybe mega investment treaties? So I'm curious about your views. Thank you.
Yeah. So Brazil, by the way, given the Director Generalship of the WTO is in a good position to bring in new ideas, and I believe that investment, the whole investment system that we currently have, has over 3,000 treaties that are bilateral between different countries in the world. And it really cries for some more multilateralized, integrated effort. But then there remains the question as to what specifically, which is the question I was given, what specifically should be the form of these bilateral investment treaties? Should we just simply take the ones that exist, which are actually quite controversial today, or should we develop some new ones? Which reflect both the concerns of developed and developing countries to a greater degree, both the host countries and the source countries. And I believe we ought to be thinking about new forms of treaties, but those should be the topic of a negotiation that I would love to see take place among interested countries, not all members, in a multilateral setting, so that those countries would get together and agree among themselves about what sort of frameworks make sense for them, given their priorities. And of course, it would not be appropriate for every country at every point. And that's why I think, for instance, intellectual property should have been handled in that way, and I think investment ought to be handled in that way.
If I may add to this.
Please go ahead.
There are several dimensions to investment-related treaties and agreements. Some of them closer to consensus, or at least with wide scope to get closer, like in the intellectual property rights. Some others less. The investor protection clause embedded potentially in TTIP, like also in TPP, that's going to be something hard to reach. The European states accepting that the companies can sue the sovereigns or countries outside the scope, that's going to be a hard one. Brazil has no investment treaty, which is a pity. But let's also keep in mind the following. When Argentina broke down, Argentina had 50 outstanding investment treaties, and that did not ring-fence the investments when it came to the Argentine breakdown. But I agree with you, this must be embedded, but as long as some middle ground can be found with respect to the feasibility of having companies suing countries outside them. We saw the whole controversy around the Marlboro, Philip Morris, suing the state of Uruguay because of the campaigns against smoking Marlboro. And potentially, if Philip Morris had won that one, some harsh measures would have been taken outside for Uruguay.
If I could just come back quickly on 2 points. So the fundamental problem in these investment treaties, everyone agrees in a sense that it would be okay to have an investment treaty that limited the ability of the government to unfairly expropriate. But what people have disagreed over is what exactly is expropriation. Well, if I take over your mine, it's very clear I've expropriated it. But what if I change a regulation that causes you to suffer financial damage? Some have interpreted expropriation in that way. And this, it has been argued, has limited the ability of governments to regulate. So that if a new petroleum additive was banned in Canada, and a foreigner happened to own that petroleum additive, they could sue. That's an example of the more broader definition. So I think it is vital that we narrow the scope of what is defined as expropriation in order to make it very clear that it is not meant to constrain governments' ability to adopt health and safety regulations. Secondly, by embedding an investment treaty in a trade agreement, it actually deals with the problem that a country could ignore its investment treaty and have no ramifications, because most trade agreements allow for retaliation in the consequence of breach. So if a country violates a trade agreement, its trading partners have the ability to raise tariffs against it. And that's embedded in every one of the trade agreements. And that's why it's important, if you're going to have credible investment agreements, to make them part of the trade agreements, as opposed to having them simply subject to normal international law.
We're going to take one last question. We're almost out of time.
Sure. My name is Danilo. I'm a PhD student at MIT. My question would be directed for Professor Canuto, but I think if we have enough time, I would love to hear the other presenters' opinion on that as well. My question is about the international competitiveness of Brazilian manufacturing sector. And we have a bit of a dark horizon over there, especially because of the Chinese effect, as you mentioned. However, the Chinese effect is most focused on cheap, low-tech manufacturing, right? And perhaps Brazil may have some sectors at the high-tech end, like biopharma and etc., that could be nurtured. So my question is, first, which one would be the sectors that I would see on Brazilian manufacturing? And second, what would be the shape, if any, of industrial policy in Brazil that could nurture these sectors? Thank you.
I'm very skeptical about the traditional industrial policies in the sense that, you better give a common ground. At this moment, for instance, the best thing that the Brazilians could do to their productive system would be to tackle the doing business conditions in Brazil. The World Bank has a report, which is a fantastic one because it breaks down the life of a company, of a firm, in 10 stages, 10 windows. And they simulate in 188 countries how it is like to deal with each one of those windows or segments of a life of a company. And Brazil performs badly in most of them, except for having access to energy. And that's what helps the Brazilian average to be not as bad as it should be. Now, what I'm saying is the following. If you break down each one of them, one wonders how it is that companies survive in Brazil. Only big, larger companies survive because they put it into the price. Whereas the difficulties for new companies or new activities to flourish are hampered. And there is a lot of waste. Human talent that is used for things that do not add value. So the best industrial policy that Brazil could do, in my view, would be to tackle all those segments. Among other reasons, because each of the sophisticated segments in modern economies, they are transaction intensive, and these things affect the transaction costs. Now, and you aptly remark it, the best potential, I would say, given the fact that the aspiration of purchasing power of the median Brazilian worker will not go back to Pakistanese levels, And given that the differential in terms of wage and aspiration cannot be as well be compensated, outweighed by a higher productivity differential in the case of Brazil, there is a full range of activities that no South American or Latin America will be able to compete with the Asians. Now, this is not the case of several natural resource-based value chains that can be built. Petrobras, for instance, was in the center of its own global value chain in which it developed a capacity a technological capacity to find out and explore deep sea petroleum. And it was competitive because it was able to buy whatever they wanted, wherever they could. And the same case of Embraer. Embraer is the exception that confirms the rule. Embraer, I have a more positive view of Embraer than the one that Ciro presented yesterday. Embraer does not depend on Avionica. Embraer has a fantastic design capacity, and since it has the liberty to build their plane, buying parts and components from wherever they want, they are able to compete with Bombardier and even with Boeing in some medium-range areas. So the rule number one must be give the level playing field, improve the doing business environment, and keep in mind that particularly in some natural resource areas, there is value to be added by developing ex-ante activities, upstream activities.
I actually believe that no one has the faintest idea how to answer your question. But what I do know is that if Brazil were to implement the kinds of reforms that facilitate international trade, in its regulatory regime, that raise the costs, especially for small businesses, that miraculously, across a whole lot of different sectors, entrepreneurs are going to find ways to be competitive internationally. What I also know is that the industries and firms that were competitive when the currency was twice as strong as it is today, okay, are far fewer than the ones who have the potential to compete today. So I think the right kind of policies emphasize the removal of the obstacles to trade, A. B, the creation of an environment for all firms to succeed, and then C, providing the supply side skills and talents of the people that they need to hire in order to succeed. So that would be my prescription. Waste much less time in trying to identify specific areas and put a lot more attention on creating an environment in which these will emerge as a result of favorable inputs and costs.
Yeah, so let me build on Rob's. Actually, we were commenting that it is interesting that in Latin America, we always have the need for someone to tell us what we should produce. I mean, in Venezuela, we have that question every time. Any foreigner shows up, and the first question is, what do you think we should do? And when I go to Brazil and they ask me the exact same question, you know, I always tell them random sectors. Like, it's like, as if I know. I have no clue. And they said, like, what should Brazil do? I said, well, I don't know. Devote your life to services. And they said, what type of service? I don't know, prostitution, whatever you want. I said, like, figure it out. So I agree entirely with what Rob is saying, is that the government doesn't have a monopoly on how the future will shape. They don't have an idea of what the private sector can achieve. I can assure you the government doesn't know what you guys can do. They have no clue. So why are you expecting them to tell you what you should do? It's exactly the opposite. You should not wait for the government to tell you what you have to do. The government should create the conditions so you can prosper with the knowledge you're acquiring and the passion that you have. So get the hell out of that business.
I'd like to thank all the panelists for this very interesting and thought-provoking discussion. I think there is maybe one main takeaway, which is Brazil cannot ignore the global economy. There are huge opportunities and risks involved. Lunch will be served downstairs. Again, thank you very much for participating.
Thank you very much.